I should preface part one of the Anneke Lucas interview by saying that this interview may be triggering. I should also add that the horrors of Anneka's story seem incomprehensible, and I suggest that you read her book, Quest for Love, Memoir of a Child Sex Slave, and decide for yourself if the events that she delineates are reality. I will say that survivors of extreme abuse who have written books describe horrors that correspond to the horrors described by Anakah. I previously had psychologists on my podcast who have counseled survivors of extreme abuse, and their accounts of the abuse endured by their patients also correspond to the abuse described by Anakah. Moreover, I've done 3 podcasts on the Extreme Abuse Survey, which encompasses 1,471 persons from 31 countries. And many of their answers to the survey correspond to the abuse suffered by survivors of extreme abuse who have written books. I've been researching and writing about child trafficking for 22 years, and I've concluded that evil protects itself through 2 ways: by its viciousness and by lies. People can't believe that adults could be so vicious to children, and they experience acute cognitive dissonance. And then there's the lies that are dispensed, denying that such abuse ever occurred. My book, The Franklin Scandal, is an impeccable example of evil protecting itself by viciousness and lies. Welcome to the Nick Bryant Podcast. Today, my guest is Anneke Lucas. She wrote an amazing memoir entitled Quest for Love, Memoir of a Child Sex Slave. That's very powerful. The horror that she conveys is incomprehensible, but her prose is ornate and beautiful. So it's almost, when I read it, it was almost contradictory. Hey, Anakah, how you doing today?
I'm well, thank you. Thank you for speaking about the prose in my book. I really appreciate that.
Well, everybody that is watching or listening to this podcast should just check out her book. Her writing skills are pretty amazing. And here's a quote from the very beginning of the book that kind of, I think, sums up a lot. I have waded through that muck of shame, confronting the greatest of fears, that the messages about me which accompanied the abuse would be true. Only the experience of facing those fears yields the answer. What do you mean by that, Anakah?
Yes, I speak quite often because I've learned in the, when we speak about the healing process, for me, this started in the 80s. So we're talking about, many decades of healing. And also there's a reason why I'm 51 and now speaking about what happened to me. Now I can speak about it. I started speaking 11 years ago. I finally felt ready, at 49 years old. So what I mean by that specifically is, so abuse, I call abuse, and especially sexual abuse, there's a currency exchanged, and it is the currency of shame. That I found that from the many abusers that I had, every time I was being forced to take on some shame that didn't belong with me, that there was some message connected to it. So some abusers, they want you to feel really dirty, and then you feel ashamed for being dirty. Other abusers, they want to think that you're the active one and you're inviting them and you're the grown-up, and then you feel like it's all your responsibility and it's all your fault, of course, and then you feel shame for that. And there's lots of other messages, because we'd have to do with a lot of sadists as well, and so these messages become increasingly difficult to bear. But basically, the abuse, and especially when you're a child, it attaches a message about you to your ego. So if I've been abused by a perpetrator who wants me to feel dirty, he doesn't have to say that to me. I'll feel dirty Often they do say it, but then I'm stuck with that idea that my ego or this part of me, like I'm dirty. So now what am I going to do with that message? Because this is now, I identify now as dirty. So, I think a lot of the abusers are just trying to get on the other side of the messages that they have had to absorb when they were young. And that's how they pass it on. I've never met a sadist that I didn't think was just basically trying to feel the release of not being the one in being abused, of being the one that's receiving the humiliations, that they just need to abuse in order to finally feel that release. Um, so all these messages that are attached to your ego, there's many, of course, as sex slaves, we get extremely many of these messages, and we can't, we can't believe all of them and then live. So we split up into many different parts, but still the healing brings you back to that core message. And then you need courage to really face the possibility, is that who I am? Am I this dirty person? So then I have to look at it. And then, um, with the adult perspective, and a healthy adult perspective to that young child's experience, you can finally remove that stain and return to the innocence that was taken in that moment.
You're originally from Belgium, and you were part of the Marc Dutroux network. Marc Dutroux was an infamous pedophile who was arrested for murdering 4 girls. There were many more girls that he murdered than just those 4, but there were many indications that he was part of a larger network. And when police officers and the judiciary tried to get information on that larger network, they were basically shut down. And it's an infamous case, but the cover-up was so blatant, like the Jeffrey Epstein cover-up that's going on, and I think the P. Diddy cover-up. The cover-up was so blatant that I think it was about 300,000 Belgians hit the streets.
Yes.
And I would like to see that happen in the United States with Epstein, with Americans actually hitting the streets.
Maybe, but that these protests led nowhere because 3,000 people hit the streets when the original judge, who was sincere, got thrown off the case on a technicality. And it was clear to everyone that he had been thrown off this case because he was sincere and he wanted to make a change. Then it took 8 years for that case to go to trial. And by the time, this was from 96 to 2004. So Marc Dutroux was a pimp for the network who was not active when I was in it because I'm older, and he's not that much older than me. But one of the defendants in that case was Michel Nihoul. And Michel Nihoul was someone I had quite a bit to do with. I think he arrived a year before I was released. So I have extreme memory that you read about, and he was on trial, but the most significant charge was that he was also responsible for the kidnapping of these children that he was let off on by the judge. And the majority of the jury found him guilty, but the majority wasn't great enough, so the judge had to decide, and then the judge let him off on that charge. So he ended up doing really 1 year of prison for other things, minor things.
And Marc Dutroux is the only other one that really took the fall for
Yeah.
that entire network. But we've seen that
Yes,
with
and those 300,000 people, yeah. And I want to say that the 300,000 people that marched in the streets, by the time 2004 came around, so much had happened, but the brainwashing of the people was quite successful in that time. The pushing the pushing that narrative that he was alone, or that anyone who stood with the survivors, really, or the children, was being sentimental and ridiculous. That's really what happened.
And in your book, you say this about these elite pedophile networks. Elite pedophilia is the world's best protected secret. And it makes sense because the perpetrators need to ensure that you The reader will never focus on them. They prefer that we all keep busy with the many distractions they throw in our way to keep us divided. Dysfunctional siblings of a global family with the psychopaths and narcissists for parents. That is truly a devastating statement that these psychopaths run our world and they basically have us on a treadmill. So we can't look to the right or the left. We've got to keep looking forward. I think debt, a lot of Americans are in major debt. And I know a lot of them can't really follow a lot of the news because they work very hard during the day to pay for their children's food, eventually their children's college, their car payments, their house payments. And they come home, they're tired, and they watch a little television, eat dinner, and maybe play with their children. And then that's it. And then you've got the news cycle. That's 24 hours, which goes quickly, jumps to another story. So a lot of people aren't in the United States aren't really cognizant of that Jeffrey Epstein was covered up by the government, which kind of amazes me. One thing about your book, I've read the books of several survivors with dissociative identity disorder. And you talk about and you alluded to this earlier, you talked about the perps having parts. And as far as I know, and I could be wrong, you're the only survivor that really talked about these perps themselves suffering from dissociative identity disorder.
Of course, yeah. I mean, it's not every child rapist that knows all the time that that's what they're doing. They don't identify as such. And for many, they have to push it away, just like we push everything away, so that they can get through the day as well. And so they can also attach to the image that they put out onto the world. I think a lot of these people are so successful in presenting an image that is really exactly the opposite of who they are, because they don't know it in the moment.
And you talk about how the perps' fear ultimately translates into violence.
I think everybody's fear translates into could potentially. All violence, I think, is based on fear. Yeah.
I believe that the vast majority of the negative things that we do are predicated on fear. And when people are afraid, you can get them to do just about anything. And a little later in the book, you name a couple of names, but then you talk about how powerful these men are. And you say big names means big danger. What do you mean by that?
Well, specifically in the Belgian network, whereas Trafficked in the first years, it was very clear that the more important the guests were, the more danger there was. And this is just, if nothing, but for the protection they have. And that can always mean that if they are going to be with a child, the easiest way sometimes is to make sure that child is never going to speak is to simply kill it. So certainly because of the protection they enjoyed, the network protection, you could say they enjoyed, you never knew. And also, the other thing is that a lot of these very powerful people, well, they have gotten to these positions because of their psychopathic tendencies. So when you're in this network, you get into some kind of a club, whether it's through the Freemasons or whatever club you enter into. Once you get into what I call the network, which was basically a lot of parties and a connection and people that were connected on this particular level, mostly through blackmail. Well, the ones that are going to do the horrible things are the ones that can be blackmailed. That's why there's so many pedophiles that are part of this network. Not all of them are pedophiles, but at the very least, someone has to shut up. And then someone who's maybe not a pedophile is going to be invited to maybe a ritual, anyway, something that they cannot go back from. So it is those who are have the least scruples that do best in this setting. It's a mafia.
Alicia Owen is really one of the major protagonists of the Franklin scandal. She was put on trial because she refused to recant her accounts of being abused in the Franklin pedophile network. And she once told me that when monsters get scared, it's very, very scary. And I think that that is apropos to what you've said.
Yes, and I have had one situation where I scared a monster, you could say, or I really just went against, you know. And I recently named David Rockefeller, so I can speak about that now, I guess. That he, at age 9, he took an interest, and then I was treated very differently, and I was sort of, the idea was that I was going to be part of the global network then, more elevated level of the network than the Belgians. And so for that, I was sent to mind control training, and that changed me very drastically. Actually, it's very professional. And for a year, I was going along with everything. At age 9, I was actually given a choice, which at that moment, there's no way I would have refused it, because I went from being treated really horribly to suddenly being treated much, much, much better. So I was tempted, and of course I said yes at age 9, but at age 10, I didn't want to go along anymore. And so I expressed, basically, when I say I rebelled, is I expressed dismay. And just that one time that I didn't go 100% along with David Rockefeller became the complete turnaround, where he went from the part that he was in when he was around young girls who were his own slaves, that he was, basically forming and creating, to be his personal elite sex slave that would make him millions of dollars. And that would be also, there was a little bit of the fact that he introduced me to that life and everything, and so I should be so grateful to him as well. Like, he thought I was so lucky to have met him. So when I complained, his shift was so drastic, it's really taken a very long time. He became the monster again, and I often thought why I wasn't killed, and I can talk about that if you wish, but basically I was from being a star, in the making. That it was pretty much all set to go, because I just had gone through what was my entry into their club. And I was thrown in a cage, I was drugged, suddenly I was being treated as the lowest of the low. And he personally was there a little bit. The same doctor that had trained me in mind control was also coming. I was taken from the cage, which was on a sort of a lower level of an official building in Germany, to a second lower level where there were dungeons. I was chained on the wall in a little dungeon, where I heard people scream. Oh, it were adult screams, but there were things going on there. And I was tortured, but mostly with being yelled at. And so the things that I had been made to do in the network, and especially under his direction, I was now, when I was doing it for him, I was praised for these things. And now I was being told that I was bad for these same things. And because the humiliations and the treatment was so horrific and it lasted for so long, that reprogrammation went very, very deep. And most of my young adult life was really marked by that reprogrammation, where I felt, where I was supposed to feel completely unworthy, and I could never have any success. But I was bad. I was evil. And that was the message that was coming to me. That's what happened when I went against their plans.
And if you had gone along with David Rockefeller, you had set a star. How would your life trajectory had been different?
Well, they had described my life very in great detail. I was invited by a Rothschild at his home where Rockefeller went to get permission, basically, to create this persona. He'd already been, what I realized later was triage. He was basically looking at what I could do and um, triaging whereas I felt I was getting attention from a father figure. I was also getting trained sexually, not to be mistaken about that. But the way I was treated was so much better. And then I was invited into the family. And Rothschild was extremely observant. David Rockefeller spoke French to me and didn't realize I also understood English. And he had said something when Rothschild was there, and that something was insulting to me. And I never showed my feelings, obviously, but Rothschild had picked up on it. And so he spoke to me in English, or he had me alone in a meeting. He spoke to me in English, so he let me know that he knew that I understood what was being said. And he and basically invited me into the family. And the first promise he made that was that I would be respected, which was the thing that I was lacking and why I was feeling insulted. So he immediately picked up on my deepest need to be respected. And then after that, I was, receiving the description of what my life would be like. And at that time, it was extremely tempting. I was going to be a star in France, a singer, actress. I was going to be, and I was also got very detailed descriptions of what my life would look like, the entourage, the apartments, the cars, the yachts, where I would be. I have a house on the Côte d'Azur. Everything was laid out. It was all very clear what my life was going to be like and how, of course, I would be treated, cover of the magazines and all of that. Most beautiful woman, which, all of these things, this beauty thing, like I was not really that beautiful. And I always knew there's always more beautiful, I was not. But when David Rockefeller looked at me the first time in this new way, I did, feel like say that because of his projection, this came out of me. And then the persona was going to be completely based on, sensualizing the child and then bringing out those most sensual features. And of course, as a young woman, it would be the same.
And you were taken to Germany for mind control. You don't get into it too much in the book. I've had 3 episodes, or I've done 3 episodes on the extreme abuse survey, where 1,400 extreme abuse survivors answer a number of questions. And the two countries that generate the most mind control survivors, according to the extreme abuse survey, are the United States and Germany. What was it in Germany that was different than what you had to deal with in Belgium?
Oh, Belgium were not professionals compared to the Germans, that's for sure. The Belgians, I was not ever, I call it official mind control training. I was never taken to a place, and I understand they do exist now because I do work with survivors, and the Belgians have caught on. But at the time when Paul van den Boeynant, so the head of the network, the visible head of the network was the then Minister of National Defense, Paul van den Boeynant, although the royals were really in charge. He was acting like a mafia boss. He came from a humble background, and he wasn't a believing Satanist. So he was a sadist, but he did not wear, nobody ever wore robes that I saw. I think that I saw in the first 3 years. So they put on a ritual when David Rockefeller came to town, or came to Belgium for the Bilderberg meeting in 72. So they did that to please David Rockefeller. But before that, I had, it was clear to me that Paul van den Boeynants, who started as a butcher, did not care about that. But he did do things to children. For example, he would bring children together and then have them do things, and he would force them, and he would, ask the questions that are never really, where there is really no right answer. So he did it, but it was one thing here in this space with one person, and then another time it would be somewhere else in another space. So it was not like in Germany. I went to Heidelberg. There was this house. It was mostly happening in the basement. It was a villa near the Schloss in Heidelberg. There were also some things happening in the Schloss. But in this house, I wasn't the only child. The doctor in charge was Hans Hamsen, who had been a Nazi. And he knew what he was doing. And there were 3 handlers who were in charge. I believe they were East German. I don't believe that they were West Germans. They were young men, 20s, but they were mostly doing everything, going. But I was being put through these programs. I was put through the alpha, beta, delta, theta programs while I was there. And they were doing it, and it was very, very unique to what I was going to become.
I know that beta programming is essentially sex slave programming, and delta programming is assassin programming. What are these other types of programming that you just mentioned?
So the alpha is like, I got very, very intensive physical training. And I still do this type of yoga that's called Ashtanga yoga, which resembles what I was made to do there, which is for strength and flexibility. And of course, it keeps you healthy. I do it because it keeps you healthy. I liked that training because it gives you energy, and it keeps you healthy and flexible and strong. And that was the idea behind it. So we were challenged physically running, so that was what I received while I was there. The beta training for me there was never involved sexual abuse. It was all with different things, electrodes and being screamed at, mixed with forced to watch films and having to guess what men want, or having to guess at their weakness. And then being drowned, or being strangled, as a punishment slash going into the theta, which is, for me, I was put in saltwater tanks, in a saltwater tank for a long time, in water that was too deep for me to fall asleep. So drifting in the salt water in the dark for days, I think, I don't know, but it was long. So you get past the state of exhaustion, and being weightless, it really opens your psychic abilities. And it was very specific because I was already, I don't know if that's why, but basically there was a German guinea pig politician who I'd been given his photo. I had to focus on him. And I had to get into his mind and report what I was feeling in my body, which was when he was thinking of me, and I would feel it in my body. And then so it's mind control, classic mind control. I had to find his weakness, which is basically his vulnerability, which is really his blind spot, which is connecting to his own trauma or fear. So his weakness in this case was that he was aging out. He was not chancellor anymore, and he didn't know why he was not at the top of his game anymore in the network. and he didn't understand why he wasn't on the inside anymore. And he wanted to get back in, but he didn't know how. And it really was because he wasn't that sadistic. He thought of himself as a good man. He was a pedophile. He liked girls my age. That was clear. But he didn't think that he was so bad, that he was a bad man. He thought he was a good man because he loved Germany and he loved the Germans, really. And so he had some good qualities. And he didn't realize that it was his goodness that was his weakness for the network. So I had to, he had been told about me, and then I had to then use his weakness, which is his fear, to create urgency that he would want me and fall in love with me. And he was told that about me, and then I had to literally think thoughts while my consciousness was sort of in his body-mind system. And I was around, I was hearing, I was smelling things that he was smelling, I was hearing things sometimes, and then I was feeling his thoughts. And then I had to, with, my willpower, insert thoughts into his consciousness that had urgency behind them. And the urgency was that if he wouldn't want to be with me right away, he would miss out altogether because I would become too big, and then he would be out and you'd never find a way in. But if he got to me soon, then I could bring him back into the inner circle of the network. So it was that, I know it sounds really crazy, but that's the training that while I was being sleep deprived, and, of course, you also can't panic. So you're floating, so you're forced to relax. Very difficult to get back in touch with in the healing process, that this beneath this relaxed state is all this incredible fear. But that's how it was done.
So you're essentially talking about sensory deprivation.
Yeah, and also I think the weightlessness is an important factor to release psychic abilities. And that's the Theta training, is that psychic training.
I have an MK Ultra document that talks about training children and to make them into psychics. And the way that is proposed is electric shock, hypnosis, drugs, and quote unquote psychological tricks. So the CIA was definitely working at enhancing people's psychic abilities throughout MK Ultra. Your mother, unfortunately, was your primary pimp. She was the one that brought you to the various get-togethers.
Yeah.
And she was being paid money, from what I understand. The people in the network gave her money to deliver you.
Yes. She really wanted to belong, but she never was invited in because of her particular expression, I think, of her mental illness. Because I really think that they're all completely crazy, but I think her craziness expressed itself in a way that she was so eager to be part of the cool club that that her eagerness and her enthusiasm really were dangerous. And so she was never allowed in, but she was paid, and I found that out after I was, she brought me back one last time after I was supposedly rescued to a situation, and there it was discussed in front of me that she couldn't help herself, and so this was a freebie.
And love is so elusive in that type of an environment. This is a quote from your book. I feel like I am dying. Once again, it seems that power is obtained through the theft of love, and love is the energy which the powerless give to the powerful to obtain love, and that neither the power nor the love is real. I was given a lot of love. I grew up in a very unorthodox environment. but I was given a lot of love, and I would have great difficulties in my teenage years and in my early 20s. But I think that the love that I got early on was enough to love in my sails to get me through those very turbulent seas. And I mean, you basically had like a facsimile of love. Did you ever feel loved by your mother or anyone else in the network?
Not by my mother at all. So my mother, it was all lies. So there was a very big narrative about my mother and how she loved me, and of course I loved her. But you know, when you're healing and you're being faced with the truth, it's like what was left is like there was really nothing. I don't ever remember her ever being kind or tender. Never, never. But I was loved in the very beginning of my life when my mother was single in 1963. She gave me to the local daycare center, which was just run by the city and in Brussels. And the woman who was there, you know, I do remember. I mean, I've had traumatic memories from early on when my mother was already abusing me in infancy. And also, I have felt the reflection I was receiving from this woman who was like my real mother at the time. And I was there quite a lot. And so when I got back in touch with it, actually through songs that she was playing, it was very interesting. These children's songs were right from that area, um, where we were in Brussels, where the area in Brussels even, you know, it was that precise. And I found them back on YouTube, and when I was listening to them years later, I'd always remembered one little song, and I'd always remembered the words in a French, and she was French speaking, and my mother is Flemish, and I started speaking French, and I was singing these songs. And when I heard the songs, I felt this warmth and sweetness, you know, the sweet vibration and this warmth of that atmosphere of being seen as, you know, who I was at the time was an innocent baby. And she saw that innocence and she reflected it and she gave me, you know, she knew clearly that I wasn't treated well. And then I sort of melted back into her presence. And she actually put me on her body with a makeshift wrap because that wasn't done at the time with sheets. So I remember her blue frock. I remember, you know, very little, just that she had curly hair and it was gray. And then being on her body, I just remember the vibration and the sense of the sweetness and the warmth. And that's what I got. And I think it gave me self-esteem that in the beginning, certainly when I was taken to the network, I knew that this was wrong and that they were wrong.
We've all seen Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut, and you were taken to a number of milieus. How were they similar or different than what Stanley Kubrick captured?
Yeah, I think it captured it quite well, although maybe a little more stylized than what I experienced. In my experience, it was just a lot more and a lot more messy. Sometimes, yes, the vibe was similar somehow, though, cold and empty and you know, obviously extremely materialistic, and people are also hiding, and some are hiding and others are showing themselves. A lot of women are naked. But what's always missing in all of these depictions or any show that you watch is the children.
With the occult gatherings that you were part of, and I've talked about this before on my podcast, the highest sacrament is the defilement or annihilation of innocence. Everything, all the values are turned upside down. You talk about this in your book. And you talk about actual children being murdered. And some of these get-togethers, and I really don't want to call them parties. And when you were recovering your memories and you remembered these horrific events of these children being murdered, how difficult was that to deal with?
Well, these horrors, when I was getting in touch with these horrors, you know, obviously first I didn't want any of it to be true. I also didn't have a context for it in the beginning. I couldn't imagine how my life with my family and the narrative that they spun, it could possibly have happened, even if I didn't remember most of my childhood. But I was feeling it. I was feeling the horror, and I was feeling the fear and the pain. And I had a therapist no, when I was working with a therapist, and that was the Dutroux case in '96 gave me the context that I'd been getting flashbacks for 10 years by then, nothing in a narrative form, nothing with a beginning or an end, just flashes. And a lot of suicidal thoughts following the flashes. So programs. So at first it took 10 years to find 10 years of therapy, by the way, but no room for the flashes. Therapists who didn't really want to know, therapists who were not open. So I was getting memories of sexual abuse, some incest memories, but nothing relating to my mother with this therapist and nothing related to the network. So in '96 with the Dutroux case, I got the context, and I found a therapist in '97 who was finally, she didn't know SRA, but she was open. And then that's where, in the beginning, it was so hard when I finally found someone that was safe. When everything was coming back, it was just really hard to get through the day in those days. Because you don't want it to be true. And it's mostly, I think, that you don't want to identify yourself as being the person seeing that or going through it. Because it's so different from however I identified, you know, the whole way you identify yourself completely crumbles when you have memories like that, because this is not who I was. This is who I am, but you can't do that immediately. There is a sort of a breakdown of identity that is extremely frightful, and you have to have faith to go through it. Otherwise, you would never dare. But meanwhile, going through these horrors was, oh my goodness. And then I was trying to hold jobs. And my life was very, very, very difficult as an adult. Going through this healing, and at the same time, it was like, when is this going to end? There was so much that was overwhelming me. And then it's like, no, the next thing is even worse. You know, it has to end. But there was tremendous feeling. So there were several victims, but there was one boy. And this was how I had met David Rockefeller. But that ritual, that boy, he was special. And his name is Wouter. And I'd seen him in the network. And because he was 7 years old, but he was able to, because he was special, he was completely innocent. And I just really wanted to protect his innocence. And I just really wanted to protect him. And I loved him. And I think that I was the child that was given to be sacrificed in this ritual that was set, basically organized for David Rockefeller around the Bilderberg meeting in '72. So we were the two of us. And I had him in my arms. And I try to hold on to him, and I try to sell him, you know, because the idea was that I was going to be sacrificed and he would be raped. And when David Rockefeller saw that he was special, he changed it around.
And how was he special? Just his innocence, or he had
Slow. He was
file?
slow.
What's that?
He was slow. He was mentally handicapped.
Oh, okay. And you ultimately meet someone named Patrick. You're 10 years old, and I believe he's in his early 20s. And you have, for lack of a better word, a relationship with him. Could you describe what went down between you and Patrick? And I've always wondered, Patrick seemed to have been able to protect you. And he ultimately ends up in prison, but how was he able to protect you? How did he have the clout to protect you?
Okay, just have to shift because I just got into the feeling of the boy Wouter, you know, who was killed, and that was extremely traumatizing when he was killed. And I just wanted to say that in the 90s, though I did not remember who the American was, I didn't remember a face or didn't remember any name. His name was David. That's what I knew. That I was grieving for that death of that little boy in the early 90s. And so the events around meeting David Rockefeller were still very present, and then working through various aspects of it. And it was just very, very difficult to work through that grief because I was so attached to that little boy, seeing his innocence and wanting to protect it, and then so miserably failing that he was literally ripped out of my arms. And yeah, feeling that I failed him was very strong. So so he was 7 years old and he was sacrificed, and it was clear that he was that it was going to be him because he was slow, because he was mentally handicapped. So he was considered not as valuable. So yeah, so those were the circumstances in which I met David Rockefeller. And so it began this very strange, different time in the network where I was now going to be part of the network for a year until my rebellion 1 year later. And then I found myself back in the Belgian network where I don't think the Belgian boss, you know, Paul van den Boenans, the Minister of National Defense, I don't think he knew what had happened. I don't think anyone was told. They just must have noticed that there were no requests anymore or something. But Patrick was brought there by his father. He was just 20 or something at the time. And his father was really, well, he was sort of an upper middle class commercial. You know, he had stores, they had stores. But this father obviously wanted to climb. He was there, and he had brought his son with him already. And the only reason that Patrick had any clout in the beginning was because everybody knew he had a gun, and he was not afraid to use it. So just because he was known as a violent kid or a violent gangster, whatever, you know, he had already done things, he said. He spoke about things to me. He said that's what he knows how to do, and he's killed people already. And I think just for that was the reason that he was interesting in the beginning, and he was free. I believe, and I don't know if that's clear from the book, but I think that the reason he was asking me about things that had already happened to me beforehand was because he was trying to figure out how this network works, how this operates. And I think he was just learning through me. And he was interested in seeing what he was going to do with it.
And how would you describe your interactions with Patrick? I mean, he's obviously a predator, but there were some moments where he was very, very kind and compassionate to you. When you look back at Patrick, what are your thoughts about him?
Well, I think that when Patrick met me and I was programmed to please men. And when he met me, I defied him, which in a network context could mean your life if you defy the wrong person, you know. But I defied him intuitively or instinctively, you know, with my training, and it moved him. And I think he saw in this kind of defiance the rebel child that he wasn't, you know, because he ends up, I think what he ended up doing, and I think he revealed that before he released me, was that all of the abuse that he had suffered with it at the hands of his parents, the sexual abuse from both his mother and his father, and the violence that he'd suffered from his father that had crippled him, that and having put a gun to his head. I mean, he'd had everything from his parents. He did all of it to me, but it was a very slow way in with this falling in love and the desire, and he protected me because he wanted it to come from me. And so for about 6 months, I wasn't being touched by anyone because he wouldn't let anybody else touch me. And then, you know, he in front of my eyes, he threatened Michel Nihoul of all people and said that he would kill him if anybody touched me. So he had this peculiar authority, and I would say that he was very un-Belgian in the way that he was, and at least at that time. You know, he had a certain, may sound paradoxical, but he had a certain honesty about him that was, you know, Belgians would, and especially the ones in the network, would be extremely reserved and always calculating. And he was not really like that. So he was different and he was young. And because of him, I didn't have to have sex with anybody for 6 months, which was incredible. And it was very healing also. When he was asking me, even though he was, you know, most likely he was just finding out from me how things work, I was having my first therapy sessions. I was already going back into the painful things that had happened. And I was also now reporting, I was speaking about them, which is, I remembered those things first because they had been spoken, they had been said, they had been reflected. So he was very helpful. Then he abused me worse than anybody. But I felt his desperation underneath all of his abuse. And not that I stayed connected with him, but I think at the end, what happened was that there was another sort of a soul connection that went beyond all the physical and everything that happened psychologically, that there was an attachment from his side as well.
That's what comes across as an attachment. And you met a young man, I think you were 11 at the time, Peter, he was 13. And he and his friends raped you, but you nonetheless had some kind of a connection with Peter.
Right.
And he was murdered by Patrick.
Yes.
And I think Peter wanted to take you out of, you were honest to Peter about what was going on with you. I think he wanted to liberate you, but he was only 13 years old and he didn't know how.
Exactly. I was 10, he was 13. And then, you know, I was 11 and he was 14. So he tried to help, but he was himself too young and too powerless. And I think he was killed. Ultimately, you could say that it was a jealous rage, but it was also probably because I spoke to him. I revealed the secrets to somebody from the outside, and then he was killed, and then it was my turn to be killed.
And when you're talking about Peter, you say this: life has taught me that my entire value is based on my ability to get men to have sex with me. And from my perspective, my mother was a Playboy bunny. I was born in Minneapolis, but we moved to Chicago and we moved in with another bunny. And
Wow.
I didn't know, I mean, I was just a kid, but my first memories are Chicago. Actually, and I'm not being facetious about this, my first memory is of my mother getting her tails and ears back from the dry cleaners. So I was raised in a certain environment where women derive their self-esteem from being sexual. And Paulette became a prostitute, and Dee Dee became ultimately married. I think a guy who was involved with the mob and ran some strip clubs. And then my mom married an attorney. So she got the luck of the draw, I guess. And when I read that line that I just said, I kind of thought about these women that gave me a lot of love when I was a child, but they thought that their primary worth was their sexuality.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that anymore.